The fire happened suddenly, and some residents did not have time to react. This dilapidated house should have been demolished long ago. In just 2 weeks, the residents were to move into new buildings. Although everyone knew that the wiring was in poor condition, no one expected that a fire could break out, especially at night. People threw anything they could salvage out of their windows. One neighbor suddenly realized that a woman who had recently given birth to twins lived in a second-floor apartment. Her husband, a truck driver, was on a business trip. Although the flames engulfed almost the entire building, firefighters rushed to the windows and quickly found the babies. Pulling them out through immediately afterward, the roof began to crack and firefighters retreated. Eventually, the building collapsed, leaving the people trapped under a pile of burning debris. Among them was a young woman, the mother of twins. While the boy was less injured, the girl was in critical condition. The babies began to cry one by one. The doors of the ambulance slammed shut, and it left the scene with a howl of sirens. The father was not informed of what had happened until the next morning, before Albert arrived. However, his mother went to the pediatric ward and questioned the nurses in the emergency room about her grandson's condition. "We got a lot of kids here. Which ones are we talking about?" "I'm talking about the kids from yesterday's fire. Please hurry and get the doctor." The doctor arrived 5 minutes later. He'd already been told that the grandmother of the twins had arrived. "Good afternoon, doctor. Please give me detailed information about my grandchildren's condition. The boy is expected to be discharged in a day or two as he has almost fully recovered. It is very important that we are kept informed of their condition." The girl, however, has a severe burn on one side of her face that will require ongoing treatment while she grows. Otherwise, the scar will be too visible, and she wrinkled her nose. The twins had bad genes as it was, and now the scar was just a nightmare. They had always been against this marriage. The girl her son had brought home was from a dysfunctional family. Her father was drunk and froze to death. Diana says, "That girl doesn't belong next to my son Albert. You have a bright future ahead of you, college," but her favorite son disobeyed her for the first time in his life. Even though his mother worked 3 jobs and died young, he found a girl on the street and brought her home. They began living together in a building that was on the verge of falling apart. Albert went to the best law school, but instead of graduating or pursuing a career as a lawyer, he became a truck driver to support his family. Diane immediately forbade the girl from coming to her home, but her son also stopped visiting his parents. His father, Diane's husband, tried to talk to her. "Diana, you too grew up in a poor family. You came to the city from the countryside. Think about your past. You didn't become successful right away either. Why do you hate this girl so much? I didn't work my whole life to get back to where I was before. Our son needs a good, decent girl who will push him forward, not hold him back." Her husband only sighed. No one had listened to him in this family for a long time. His only function was to make money, a lot of money, and that's exactly what he was doing, Albert. His father was a lawyer, a very successful and famous lawyer. At home, he was always quiet and obedient, but in court, he was a different man. He made a lot of money because his clients were mostly rich people who were constantly suing for their wealth and trying to protect their assets. Diana insisted that her son should go to university and then become his father's assistant, but her plans were ruined by this girl. Albert arrived in the evening. He wanted to go straight to the hospital, but Diana stopped him. "Albert, sit down. We need to talk." "Mom, what are you talking about? My baby's in there. I need to see him right now. How am I going to live without Samantha?" Albert cried. "Albert, it's okay. Don't cry. You have a son." "What about my daughter? Elizabeth, listen to me carefully. You can't raise your children alone. You'll have to come home. and live with us. I will take care of your son and do my best to make sure he grows up to be a decent man." However, the girl suffered severe burns, including on her face. For the rest of her life, she will have a disfigured appearance. There is no need to burden ourselves with caring for her. She will be of no use to us. You can take both babies home if you want. You must handle this yourself and bury your wife yourself. "I won't help you, Mother." "How can you say that? They're your grandchildren." "Grandchildren? From that girl? No, thank you. I don't like you, Mom. I can handle things without your help." Albert ran outside. His mother watched him through the window until he disappeared. Her husband came over and stood beside her. "Diana, what are you doing?" he asked. "I'm sure it's what's best for everyone," she replied. "Are you serious? Our son just ran away in a state of shock," he exclaimed. "What if he hurts himself?" "I don't think so. I know my son well." Albert came home late at night, heavily intoxicated, and passed out on the hallway floor. Diane put a pillow under his head and covered him with a blanket before returning to his bedroom. "Please prepare all the necessary paperwork. We need to leave Karen as soon as possible and do it discreetly. We don't want any rumors. We'll pick Christopher up from the hospital tomorrow morning. Please don't." "I won't do it. You'll be responsible for this. Your grandson's safety is very important." The next morning, Albert was silent even as his parents gave him instructions and signed papers. He was silent when he was informed of the funeral schedule. He was silent all the way to the cemetery. When it was over, he collapsed on the new grave and burst into tears. "Please forgive me, Samantha. Please try to understand and forgive me. Someday, when I have recovered from my grief, I will find our daughter." Diane waited patiently for her son to stop his tantrums. Then she walked him to the car and said, "From this day forward, you have a new life. In the morning, everyone will know the girl is dead, so no one will judge. Someone will surely adopt her. You don't have to worry. You'll be home with your son for a week, and then you'll start working as Daddy's helper. I hope you still remember what you learned at university." After that, she sat in the front seat with her husband. He looked at her and wondered, how is it possible that in so many years I never realized I was living with a monster? Time passed. Christopher was accepting congratulations on his resounding victory, his most significant case in a decade. He celebrated at the best restaurant in town, accompanied by his grandmother. His grandmother had guided him through life, mentoring him every step of the way. Without her help, he might not have achieved such success at the age of 30. That evening, he expressed his gratitude to his beloved grandmother. Sitting next to him was Christopher's grandfather, who, despite his advanced age, offered valuable advice. It was he who had started their dynasty of successful attorneys, and Christopher never failed to sincerely thank him. No additional content was added. However, everything changed when Christopher stood up. "Let's raise a glass to my parents. Although my mom can't witness my successes, my dad used to tell many stories about her. She always seemed like a living person to Dad. I want to raise this glass to you. You have been by my side and helped me all my life. Thank you for everything." The people around the table applauded. Albert knew this would not be his son's last toast or statement. Christopher announced that he and Natalie had decided to get married. Albert anticipated Diane's furious reaction. It was time for Christopher to tie the knot of marriage, and Diane had already found the right girl for the daughter of the town's new mayor was considered unattractive and unintelligent. Despite this, she was engaged to a handsome and successful man. However, he had not yet shown much interest in her and instead spent a lot. Natalie is only a couple of years younger than Christopher. She is beautiful and intelligent, but she works as an assistant. It would be inappropriate for Christopher to marry a subordinate. Christopher waited, knowing that their announcement would end the party, then mother would cause a stir. Christopher knew that Natalie was also aware of the upcoming events, but he was sure that she could handle it. Albert watched the guests. Christopher decided to wait a while to relax. He reverted to his behavior from 5 years ago. Christopher won his first case. Afterward, they visited his mother's grave in the cemetery. Albert put flowers on Samantha's grave, as he always did. Suddenly, Christopher asked an unexpected question. "Daddy, why do you only bring flowers to Mom? Why don't you ever bring flowers for Elizabeth?" Albert was confused when he heard Christopher's question. He didn't feel like lying, but he couldn't tell the truth either. He just shrugged his shoulders and remained silent. Christopher didn't press the issue, but mentally made a mental note to return to it in the future. As Christopher grew older, he noticed one peculiarity. He couldn't understand why his grandmother held his mother responsible for everything, even though he didn't remember her. Christopher was only 2 months old at the time of the tragedy, but his father retold many stories to him. Christopher came to the realization that his father still loved her. Christopher realized that something was burning his soul. His father had insisted that Christopher live on his own, not wanting Diana to make his son as weak-willed as himself. Christopher didn't realize anything until he moved away from his grandmother. After realizing the advantages of living on his own, he thanked his father more than once. Albert considered Christopher capable and independent after their first successful business. Meanwhile, Albert had more pressing matters to attend to. He began his search for Elizabeth, but soon discovered that his mother had already done a fine job. The hospital records listed her as dead, but Albert knew she was still alive. He found a retired doctor who was working at the hospital at the time, but the man claimed he couldn't remember anything. Despite Albert's money and connections, he was unable to find any further information. For almost a year, he searched for the man who worked at the hospital that night, but he finally gave up, realizing that he had done all he could. Perhaps Elizabeth really was gone. The people in the restaurant perked up. Albert made his way to a table and took a glass of champagne, prepared to listen. He realized that his mother had done a lot for him and Christopher, but at the same time, he was firmly convinced that she had no heart. Although he treated her as he would have treated his mother, he did not love her. Christopher stood up and announced to the slightly intoxicated guests the most important news of the day. "I want to make it clear that I didn't just win a case, I won the lottery of life. 3 years ago, I met an amazing woman. Since then, I've realized that there is no better woman in the entire universe." As Christopher began his speech, the mayor's daughter looked nervously at Diana, not realizing what was going on. Who was he talking about? This girl was soon to be Albert's bride. Diana calmed the girl down by putting a hand on her shoulder. "Diana is sure that no one in their family would dare to disobey her. Albert has learned from experience that you can't go against your mother's decisions. Yesterday, I won a complicated and long-term case, thanks to Natalie's invaluable help. Without her help, it would have been impossible to finalize this case quickly and easily. After the victory, we set a date for the wedding." The guests applauded, but Grandma turned pale. Grandpa smiled in a way his wife couldn't see, and the mayor's daughter jumped up from her seat. She awkwardly tipped the salad over the edge of the table, then rushed for the exit, wiping up the mayonnaise residue and lettuce leaves along the way. Diana followed her. "Don't worry. I'll solve this problem and call you tomorrow." The girl looked at her unhappy. "Please don't get involved. Christopher loves her, and I don't want to get in his way. If we could do things the way we want, we'd live like animals," Diana replied. "I'll call you soon." Grandma returned to the table with a concerned look on his face. "Let's talk, Christopher. Grandma, I already know what you want to tell me. I'll tell you now, I'm not changing my mind. I've made my decision, and you can't change it. Please don't try to threaten me. I've been living on my own for a long time and making a good living. I don't depend on you for anything. He kissed his grandmother on the cheek. She realized that she could no longer control his life. Diane cried. He grew up and got an education through hard work. Christopher was surprised by this outcome. He felt confused, but Albert squeezed his hand and said, "Don't be nervous." Christopher realized that his father was right about his grandmother's acting ability. Ran next to her and said, "Grandma, let's celebrate." Diana realized it was time to end the performance. She stood up abruptly and turned to her husband. "We're leaving now. I have no intention of watching my grandson ruin his life," she said, casting Natalie a contemptuous glance. She muttered, "Stupid assistant." Where did she come from? Are you trying to make a good life for yourself? I have enough connections in town to prevent something like this from happening to my grandson. You're going to pay for everything you've done. Natalie turned pale as Diana and her husband walked out of the restaurant. Christopher looked at her with bewilderment. Diane was still unfamiliar with Natalie when she made the hurtful comment. Natalie asked to be given some time to calm down. She asked to get the cleaning lady to clean up the mess on the table. Christopher stepped back. Natalie could control her emotions, but it would take time. 2 minutes later, a young girl approached the table. She was in good shape, but a scarf covered half her face. The clothes under the apron were clean but very cheap. Christopher felt so angry he was literally shaking. He poured himself a shot of liquor and drank it in one gulp. Albert stepped back to give the girl a chance to clean herself up. She quickly picked up the remaining salad and picked up the tray. Most people had already left the table, but Christopher remained seated. "Excuse me," the girl said without looking up. "Please move over a little." "No, I can't." "Move your hair out of your eyes so you can." "You're waving a dirty rag over my drink." Albert looked disapprovingly at his son. Suddenly, he decided to explain why the girl couldn't find another job. "I don't think you dreamed of becoming a cleaning lady," he said. "Or do you expect to meet a rich fiancé here?" Albert paused for a moment before adding, "Well, with a body like that, it's quite possible. Your outfit is not appropriate. You should wear a shorter skirt." At that moment, Natalie walked over. Christopher was angry with the cleaning lady, and Natalie didn't understand why. "Christopher," she asked. "Wait, I can't understand." The girl was having trouble finding a rich suitor at the restaurant. She seemed to stiffen, but then straightened up. It became apparent that she wasn't as young as she first appeared, probably in her early 30s. One side of her face was completely covered by her hair. Natalie shrieked, and all the guests fell silent, looking at the same person. Christopher froze as he saw a female version of himself standing in front of him, but the woman stood silently looking at Christopher. He continued to remain silent. "I am very sorry for you. What is most important to you in life? Money or position in society?" "For me, the answer is simple: life itself. I work as a cleaner at night, and during the day I work in a factory. I do not work to buy unnecessary things for myself or to insult someone who is weaker. I work hard to buy expensive medicines for my mother. But you can't understand." The girl turned around and wanted to leave. However, Albert stood in front of her, peering intently into her eyes. Then he reached out and brushed her hair away from her cheek. Albert already knew what he was about to see. Scars were visible on the woman's cheek and forehead. She turned away to fix her hair, and Albert continued to look at her with tears in his eyes. "Elizabeth, how do you know me?" The girl looked at Albert fearfully. Christopher turned pale. "Papa, who is this?" asked Christopher. "Meet your sister, Elizabeth," replied the father. The guests began to whisper amongst themselves. Natalie looked at the girl among the men with surprise. She understood absolutely nothing about the situation. She, on the other hand, had passed away right after the fire. Christopher was also troubled by this question. "What's going on?" "Dad, I don't understand." "Elizabeth is buried next to my mother," he said, but Albert continued to remain silent. Then Christopher asked another question. "Is that why you never put flowers on Elizabeth's grave?" The girl didn't understand what was going on either. Which grave did he mean? Her mother is at home now. She's very sick, but she's still alive. What on earth had happened? However, she noticed a striking resemblance between herself and the young man. Elizabeth was frightened and ran away in the back room. She took off her apron and ran outside through the emergency exit. Albert and Christopher did not pursue her. Her whereabouts would not be difficult to locate. The restaurant patrons dispersed, leaving only Albert, Christopher, and Natalie at the large table. "Dad, is there something you want to tell me?" "Yes, it's time." Albert began to tell everything from the beginning. He told about how he met Samantha and drove her home to introduce her to his parents. After university, he worked as a driver to support his family and provide for his children, Christopher and Elizabeth, with everything they needed. He retold the story of the fire, which Christopher already knew about, but kept quiet. Albert needed to understand why the buried child was still alive after 30 years of no contact. He revealed the facts without making excuses. He started looking for Elizabeth after he reached a certain point. Christopher interrupted his father. He asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" He suggested that they would have had a better chance of figuring something out if they worked together. His father replied, "Christopher, I didn't want anyone to find out. Grandma would have been put in jail right away." He added that he wasn't even sure if Elizabeth was alive. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you because I didn't find any trace of her." According to the records, there were no children transferred from the hospital to the orphanage. At that, I assumed she died in the hospital, so I stopped looking. Christopher was in shock, wrapping his arms around his head. Natalie put her arms around him. She stroked his hair. There was silence at the table. Christopher asked, "Dad, what do we do now? She'll never forgive us. I have to find her, apologize, and offer my help. Your father's cowardice is not your fault," Albert said. Natalie intervened. "The girl is scared," and mentioned her sick mother. "Wait until morning." The waiter came over quickly. Albert sighed. "Natalie is right. We need to find the manager and get her address." Christopher found the waiter. We talked to the manager of the restaurant. However, he didn't know the girl's whereabouts. He only gave us her address and told us that Elizabeth had worked for them for over a year while her mother was ill. She was not married, probably because of the scar on her face. They decided to go to Los Angeles. Upon meeting Elizabeth, we immediately recognized the person we were talking to. Elizabeth sank heavily into a chair, and we asked, "What would you like to know?" Later, Elizabeth came home, and her mother heard her sobbing. "Elizabeth, honey," she said. Elizabeth ran into her room and fell to the floor, hugging her mother's knees. She asked, "What happened?" The mother replied, "I'm not your real mother." The woman closed her eyes. "That's it. Now I must tell you the whole truth. Elizabeth, a long time ago, you and your brother were admitted to our hospital after a fire. Your brother wasn't hurt, but your face was burned. The family took only the boy out of the hospital. They decided to give up on you. Your grandmother was rich and powerful. She bought a fake death certificate for you and then paid me to secretly transport you to an orphanage. However, I was unable to fulfill this request, So I asked her to help me make it appear that you were my daughter. She agreed to the request, but on one condition. She had to leave town for a few years. She agreed, and a week later she picked up the baby from the hospital, and they left. They came back to town 4 years later. I wish I could have told you this sooner. I've loved you since the first day I met you. I apologize, my dear. Elizabeth fell asleep in the early morning. She didn't blame her mother, but it was scary to know that she had been abandoned because of the scars on her face. It was like kicking a kitten out because it wasn't pretty. The ringing of the doorbell woke her, and she got up to answer it. Elizabeth's mother was awake, but she couldn't get up from the threshold quickly enough. She saw the man she had met yesterday, who was probably her father as well as her. He asked permission to come in and talk, but the girls backed away. Christopher and Albert entered the apartment. The apartment was modest, but clean and cozy. They walked into the room and saw a woman sitting on the couch. She looked at them with frightened eyes. They said hello to her. Albert walked up to the woman and said, "Thank you for not giving up and not being afraid to get Elizabeth to her feet." His voice was filled with pain and regret. The woman couldn't answer anything and just nodded. Would they help Elizabeth? Would they really be willing to help her little girl? Christopher and Natalie were married 6 months later. The wedding had to be postponed so Christopher's sister could be a bridesmaid. A close friendship developed between Elizabeth and Natalie. Natalie agreed to postpone the wedding date despite her growing belly and the need for a new dress. "I proposed to one woman, but I'm marrying 3 at once." Natalie was pregnant with twins, and Elizabeth had just returned from abroad yesterday. Christopher and Albert found Elizabeth one of the best plastic surgeons and paid for her surgery. Natalie was already impressed with her friend's transformation, even though Christopher hadn't seen her yet. Elizabeth forgave her biological father, although it wasn't easy. Elizabeth's mother was placed in a better clinic, and she gradually recovered. She was a beautiful woman, and Christopher noticed his father's admiration. Albert couldn't take his eyes off her. Christopher was very nervous when they went to the registry office on their wedding day. Albert joked, "Don't worry. Natalie certainly won't run away. You'll always be together now, Daddy." "Have you seen Elizabeth?" "No. She forbade me to visit her and said she'd show her new face at the wedding." A white car pulled up to the driveway, and the bridesmaids and the bride got out. Natalie's stomach was clearly visible, despite the wide dress. Christopher smiled and hurried over to the bride. On the way, he looked around the crowd for Elizabeth, but she was nowhere to be seen. He asked his wife where Elizabeth was, but she only shrugged her shoulders. Suddenly he heard someone's voice behind him and turned around to see Elizabeth standing there smiling. She was as beautiful as ever, with fine facial features that set her apart from him. There were no old scars on her face. Christopher hugged Elizabeth, and she suddenly cried. Her grandmother was unable to attend the wedding due to a heart attack. Her faithful husband stayed by her side and refused to divorce her despite everything that had happened. "I can't leave her, despite all the horrors she has done. She is still my wife," he said.